Staffan de Mistura, thanks for joining me on UpFront. On Monday, you called the attack on a UN aid convoy near Aleppo a game changer. But by Thursday, you were referring to the failed attempt in New York to renew the ceasefire as a long, painful and disappointing meeting. The bombs continue to drop on Aleppo today, and things only seem to go from bad to worse in Syria, don't they?
Well, certainly today is not a good day. What we have been watching in eastern Aleppo has been basically a return to open conflict and an attempt to take over that part, what is left of the city. But let's go back to the 9th of September. That was a good day. That was a day when Russia and America did, after very difficult, very complicated discussions until midnight, come up with a deal, an agreement, which was, in my opinion, a good agreement. Started with cessation of hostility. That's what the Syrians are asking. No more bombs. Then more trucks, and therefore humanitarian aid. And then the real issue, disconnecting al-Nusra from the rest of the armed opposition, and people tend to forget that, at the same time, a grounding of the Syrian Air Force. That would have made, if it did take place, and if it will take place, a major difference in the conflict. It didn't work out. Why? Because spoilers were actually waiting for this not to work. And because the two major co-sponsors, Russia and America, have not yet been able to actually rein in, make both sides to actually stick to that agreement.
Who are those spoilers who try and undermine these agreements, who have been undermining these agreements year after year since the war first broke out in 2011?
Your question is rhetoric, I'm sure. You know that very well. But let's put it like this.
It's not actually. A lot of our viewers would want to know, you mentioned US and Russia. There are a lot of countries involved in the Syrian conflict. A lot of people look at Syria and say, is it because of all these outside parties, the Irans, the Saudi Arabias, the Qatars, the Turkeys, the Frances, the UKs, the USAs? Who is to blame? Who are the spoilers on both sides?
Well, let's put it like this. First of all, who do you think would not agree with the fact that the Syrian Air Force needs to be grounded? Well, obviously, President Assad is clearly not happy about it. Otherwise, he would have been not able to do what he's been claiming publicly to do in Daraya and elsewhere, to reconquer the whole Syria territory. And to do so, he needs the Air Force. On the other side, put yourself in the place of the armed opposition and their sponsors. Do they really find it easy for them, or do they like the idea of disconnecting from al-Nusra, which in their view has been one of the biggest fighters against Assad, but at the same time everybody recognizes, including UN, is Al-Qaeda, regardless whether they change the name? Then you would have an answer who has no, at the moment, keen interest in making the deal working.
The attempt to take over eastern Aleppo that we're seeing today on our screens, according to residents of eastern Aleppo, is being led by Russian warplanes. And when you say that Russia and the US still both want an agreement, they do both want to end the violence, as you said on Thursday, don't actions speak louder than words? Russian warplanes are bombing Aleppo. Ergo, therefore, they have no interest in a ceasefire.
I don't believe that, and I think that's the reason why the Russians and Americans are still interested in talking to each other and hopefully coming up with a last-minute formula. The alternative is basically going back to a long period of proximity or proxy war. Why I don't think it is in their interest? Because I don't think that Russia, and I want to believe that, has any interest in inheriting a broken country, which basically is the concept, you break it, you own it. I think they are genuine in their concerns about the terrorist organizations even reaching Russia. And I think America is definitely genuine in wanting to do, during this administration, the best they can to reduce the violence and bring some relief to the people in Syria.
If you could wave a magic wand, would you try and get rid of all these, not just spoilers, but all of the outside parties involved in this Syrian war? I mean, recently Turkey got involved militarily. You must have looked at that and thought, I can't keep track of all the countries that are now involved militarily inside of Syria.
Well, then we go back into history, and you can definitely state that what started as an insurrection, and a peaceful insurrection, and then turned into violent repression, and then a militarization of that, in both the insurrection and the repression, and then became a regional proxy war, and then became an international engagement and competition, has been the biggest problem of this conflict. I've been now with the UN 46 years, 19 wars, including Afghanistan and Iraq, and the Balkans, which were complicated enough. I've never seen so many players having so many different agendas like in this conflict. But the simple bottom line can still be reduce the violence. You are not going to win this war. No one, neither Mr. Bashar Assad nor the opposition through fighting. There must be a formula, and we do have formulas coming up, but we need reduce the violence, bring some aid to the people who are exhausted.
And is this, you mentioned your experience at the UN, is this the worst war you've ever been involved in? Is this the worst war of the post-World War II era?
The answer is yes. As far as I'm concerned, no question about it. And I think globally too. This is considered the worst humanitarian tragedy since Second World War, and probably the most dangerous political military the conflict we have seen so far. Look at the possible implications. Look what happened recently with the refugee crisis and even destabilization in Europe. In fact, Brexit, in a way, is one of the last victims, indirectly, of the Syrian conflict.
When you've met President Assad, have you broached the issue of his alleged war crimes, the use of barrel bombs, for example, on residents of eastern Aleppo? Have you raised that with him personally?
I have raised the issue about barrel bombs many, many times. Trust me and believe me, many times. Because I've been also indicating every time, how can a government use this type of crude weapons when you know very well that the difference in theory between a government and terrorists is actually being very careful in avoiding civilian victims.
And therefore, isn't the use of a barrel bomb a war crime?
When you send the police inside a building because there are some gangsters, quote unquote, you don't demolish the whole building and everyone living in it. Now that will be up to the international community to decide what and who should be in any type of war crimes. There have been quite a lot of issues and things which have happened so far in this conflict which would be qualifying for war crimes.
At one point, Staffan de Mistura, the West's demand and the rebels' demand was that Assad had to go. Given the rise of ISIL, of Daesh, given the whole, it's now either Assad on the one hand or ISIL on the other, do you think that's still a realistic demand? That there is this argument that you have to choose between Assad and ISIL, whether you agree with it or not, and therefore a lot of Western governments are now saying, well, we have to live with Assad, whereas the rebels are still saying he has to go.
Well, let me qualify it like this. I hope you will, and our listeners will read between the lines. At the end of the day, I'm a mediator. I'm not a judge here. So that's my job. Point number one, we are obviously, and I was there, and I watched it with my eyes, trying, and the international community on this agrees, everyone agrees, to avoid another mistake that we did in Iraq when we dismantled the army. And look what happened. Many of them, perhaps, joined Daesh today, or some of them. Secondly, we are going to not repeat the mistakes we all admit were done when there was no follow-up on the Libya event. That was a mistake, and the proof is that we are still paying for it, and we don't have a clear solution. Three, of course, we don't want either what has been happening in Yemen, when suddenly there is a president who has been, in a way, put in a difficult or strange position and is still part of the fighting inside. Bottom line, there is a need of learning from the past. The second point regarding the possible formula is that we need to realize that you can fight Daesh. And I think everybody basically in Syria are now either claiming or actually fighting Daesh. But you can't win Daesh unless you find a political solution which includes all those who feel disenfranchised.
Is it fair then to say that you think the Assad regime should be part of a diplomatic solution in Syria? You can't just wish them away. Is that what you're saying or suggesting?
What I'm saying, and you are paraphrasing me a little bit too much there, what I'm saying is that whatever formula that we will be finding, and there will be a formula at the end of the day, needs to take into consideration the fact that the Syrian institutions, including the army, which has certainly a role to play, and an important role to play in a unified new formula of Syria, needs to be in a way non-dismantled and destroyed. Otherwise we'll have a vacuum, and the vacuum will lead either to Libya or to what happened originally in Iraq.
But theoretically you could keep the regime, the government, the institutions of state, but you wouldn't necessarily have to keep the man himself, the ruler.
I'm not commenting on this. I think it is up to the negotiations and the negotiators, the Syrian negotiators, which at the end of the day, we all say it. Can we say it and claim it, or can we mean it?
The original ceasefire agreement that the US and the Russians struck agreed to target jointly at some stage Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, the Syrian rebel group previously known as Jabhat al-Nusra and linked to al-Qaeda. What do you say to Syrian rebel groups who say to you as the mediator that, look, we can't just abandon these guys. These guys helped us break the siege in eastern Aleppo. These guys are the only ones fighting against people dropping barrel bombs on us. What do you say to those rebels who say we can't just detach ourselves from Nusra as the UN and as the US and Russians demand of us?
Well, I can see their problem. I cannot deny that. But at the same time, I would tell them, do you see also the advantage that we would have all, and particularly Syrian people, if the Syrian Air Force would be grounded? Do you realize that there would be no barrel bombs? Do you realize that what you're seeing in Aleppo now, while we are talking, would not be any more possible? So deals are made based on some type of formula. And this formula, when you look at the last part of it, is a very important element.
Do you genuinely believe, though, that Assad would agree to ground his air force if there was no Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, no Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria?
The Russians, in my mind, were genuine, in my opinion, when they negotiated with the Americans on this. And the Americans were also sincere.
And just before we finish, there was a lot of outrage in August when the Guardian newspaper revealed that the UN had awarded contracts worth tens of millions of dollars to people closely associated with Assad and his family and friends as part of its aid program in Syria. Not only has the UN aid mission in that country been compromised, many say, but the UN itself, where you are today, its reputation as a peacemaker, as a humanitarian organization, some say will never recover from the stain on its conscience that is Syria.
When you are on the spot, you are dealing with whoever. Look at this hand. Can you see it? I've been shaking the hands of many unpleasant people in my life in order to be able to get one convoy to the people who were starving and deserved to be alive once the situation was solved. When we are in Damascus, we have to deal with those who are in Damascus. When the convoy comes across the line, do you think that our colleagues are not dealing with the insurgents? Of course they are. That's the only way to do it. And don't you think that, in fact, there will be some of this happening? The alternative is sitting and complaining. Given another example, when I've been talking to the opposition, you think I'm using a Toraya? Or am I using a normal mobile phone? Obviously a mobile phone. And who owns that mobile phone company? And who is paying to those bills? Both us and insurgents in order to get it. The alternative would be not be able to talk. Well, in other words, let's be pragmatic. Our priority is anything needs to be done in order to reach the people who deserve to be reached. That means sometimes accepting what we don't like to accept, dealing with those who are actually stopping the aid and being able to deliver it anyway.
You once said in reference to Syria, sometimes I feel like a doctor who is trying to keep a patient alive, but I'm only able to relieve the pain. At what stage, Staffan de Mistura, do you hold your hands up and say, I couldn't save the patient, it's over?
A doctor would never say that unless he believes in euthanasia, which I don't believe in. A doctor will say, I will continue, me, the UN. No one is indispensable, but the UN. And I know the Secretary General feels the same, and I'm sure the next Secretary General will feel the same. We will never abandon a patient because the pain needs to be reduced, the patient needs to be kept alive, and who knows, perhaps tomorrow morning, we will have a medicine for that disease.
Staffan de Mistura, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.